Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Flynn Craddy. I'm the Executive Director of the Council on Academic Freedom, which has organized this event. If you don't know much about it, the Council is a nonpartisan faculty organization here at Harvard that's committed to promoting free inquiry, intellectual diversity, and civil discourse. We launched in March and currently have about 138 members with representatives from every Harvard school, although there's always room for more. We've gathered together to ask the question, what is campus free speech for? And that's a timely question. Some of you may have seen that 2 weeks ago, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, released its annual campus free speech rankings. Out of 248 surveyed institutions, Harvard came in 248th place with a score of 0. Now, from a certain point of view, that just means that Harvard is number one again. There are some reasons to be concerned. Now, we should perhaps take these sorts of rankings with a grain of salt. The U.S. News recently just ranked Harvard, for instance, the number 2 university in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And there are some reasons to be doubtful about that, but it is clear that we have work to do. If Harvard is to be a place where all members of the community are encouraged to speak freely in the common pursuit of truth, veritas, we will need faculty, administrators, students, and alumni to work together. Speaking of alumni, I want to especially thank the Harvard Alumni for Free Speech, which has co-sponsored this event and is sponsoring the live stream, and welcome to all of you who are joining us on YouTube. Now, our plan for today is first to hear a talk from Ned Hall, then a response from Danielle Allen, followed by a Q&A from the audience. And if you're watching on the live stream, you can go ahead and put your questions in the chat. I think you do have to register to do that, and then we'll try to take at least a couple of them at the end. And I'm going to introduce our speakers in just a moment, but first I'd like to invite the Dean of Harvard College, Rakesh Conant, up to say a few words. Rakesh.
Good afternoon, everyone. Aw, good afternoon. Thank you, Danielle. When I first taught at MIT, I said something like "Good morning," and then people just wrote it down. So, hi to my friends at MIT. I'm just going to briefly start because Ned and several other people have been part of another group working with us on this at the college. But I'm just going to briefly start with the college's mission and talk about. I know these are separate efforts, but what our shared values and common interests in this is. So the mission of Harvard College has been for almost 4 centuries now to educate the citizens and citizen leaders for our society. We do this through the transformative power of liberal arts and science education, and we talk about that transformation in 3 places: intellectual transformation, social transformation, and personal transformation. And I think the intellectual transformation is all of them are important, and they're all interrelated to the idea of being able to express ourselves openly, thoughtfully, and in the search of veritas, but also recognizing that veritas is not something easily attained. It has to be approached. It has to be recovered, discovered. Things that we once believed to be true turn out to be more contingent or complex or not even true at all. And so the values and the norms of that are absolutely critical to doing this. In working with Ned over the last few years, I think it's almost 3 years.
That's right.
When we started working with students, staff, and faculty on something we call the Intellectual Vitality Initiative. And there's a lot of work that we've been doing at the college on that, and it will be more to hear on that this year and in the coming months. But I want to read a statement that this group drafted, because I think in many ways it represents, I think, some of our highest aspirations. And what Ned always described to us as the positive space in which this exists. And again, this is not an official statement, but Amanda Clabo, our Dean of Undergraduate Education, shared it in convocation with our incoming students. But I think it represents these values. Members of the Harvard College community affirm the value of intellectual vitality, meaning a spirit of open and rigorous inquiry. To this end, we believe that our community is best served through the charitable exchange of ideas, in which we take as given one another's best intentions and treat each other as partners in the pursuit of knowledge and truth. In doing so, we recognize the importance of giving and receiving criticism of ideas without extending these critiques to people themselves. Further, an engagement with and sincere consideration of competing views lies at the heart of education more broadly. To maintain a spirit of intellectual vitality, we must cultivate in ourselves an attitude of humility, respect, and curiosity toward each other. Through the spirit of intellectual vitality, we're able to strengthen our perspectives and reconsider foundational assumptions about the world, society, and our place in it. While this may prove discomforting, testing core ideas is necessary to grow in wisdom and understanding. All members of the Harvard College community therefore commit ourselves to uphold intellectual vitality in our respective capacities. We agree to foster this spirit of rigor, charity, and open exploration in classrooms, student organizations, and social interactions. Of course, those are really powerful words. Words matter, but so do the underlying structures, norms, practices, and skills in achieving that vision. And so I'm really glad to be here and very excited to hear both Danielle and Ned today. So thank you.
Thanks, Rakesh. And I just want to embarrass a former student of mine, Tobias, over there, who was one of the first people I started talking to about these issues 3 years ago, and who was instrumental in forming the student group and in getting that statement drafted. So, sorry, Tobias. Couldn't resist.
Thank you, Ned. Well, let me just introduce Ned now, who's you've already met. Ned is the Norman Vuilleumier Professor of Philosophy here at Harvard. He works on topics in metaphysics and epistemology that overlap with the philosophy of science. So in the Q&A, if you have any questions about the fundamental nature of reality, Ned will be happy to answer them. He's also keenly interested in the quality of our academic discourse on campus, as you've already heard. He's one of the co-presidents of the Council on Academic Freedom. He's also someone who tries to reflect this in his teaching. And this spring will be teaching again his gen ed course, Reclaiming Argument, Logic as a Force for Good. And I encourage any undergrads who are here to consider taking that course. Ned is known for bringing cookies to class with him if you need an incentive. Danielle Allen will be giving the response. Danielle is the James Bryant Conant University professor at Harvard, as well as the director of the Allen Lab for Democratic Renovation. She writes and teaches on political philosophy, ethics, and public policy, and is the author of numerous books, the most recent being Justice by Means of Democracy. In addition, she's a nonprofit leader, an occasional gubernatorial candidate, and a leader here at Harvard, just once, but maybe again. You never know. And a leader here at Harvard and thinking especially about the relationship between diversity and its relationship to academic freedom. So please join me in welcoming Ned and Danielle.
Okay. Thanks, Flynn. Thanks, Rakesh. That was lovely. Thank you also just to the Harvard Alumni for Free Speech for co-sponsoring, and special thanks to Professor Allen, Danielle, for agreeing to do this. The conversation is going to be orders of magnitude more interesting, given that you're going to get to hear from her and not just me. Just a couple remarks to begin with about why this issue matters so much for me. It has become over the years kind of personal, and that has to do with my own kind of odyssey, my own career odyssey. I came to Harvard in 2005 after spending 11 years at MIT, and MIT was great. Don't get me wrong, loved that department. Met some very fine people there, some of whom I see in this audience. But it was only when I came to Harvard and started interacting with undergraduates that I sort of discovered what it was like to have a job that wasn't just fun, but felt like a calling, a constant source of meaning and hope. And that really came about because of the passion, the idealism, the creativity, the sort of curiosity of the students I was engaged with. And we all know that's kind of passion and curiosity and ability to engage is something that needs to be sustained within a community. It's not easy. Social media has made it much harder. Increasing polarization in our country has made it much harder. And now what I hear more and more from students is something that's a little sad, that they come to Harvard hoping to mix it up with other students who see things differently in a really productive and engaging way. And in the words of one student who I asked, like, oh, are you getting those kinds of conversations? He said, well, with carefully vetted friends, I have them, right? Whereas in the classroom, what I hear from colleagues more and more is they see students self-censoring. No. Not engaging across disagreement. And when we think about the resources the college has to offer, like the incredible diversity of perspectives from people who are very thoughtful and creative in thinking through and arguing for and presenting and articulating those perspectives, not to engage across those boundaries seems like an incredibly missed opportunity. So for me, there's this sort of personal element, this place I love. I want to sort of do whatever little part I can to like help revitalize some of the things that make it so wonderful. Just some orienting remarks about what's going to happen this afternoon. So you see those two words juxtaposed there, free speech. I'm not so worried about the crowd in this room, but in case people out in YouTube land are paying attention, you might look at those words and you might think like, oh, is this going to be a fight? After all, those two words now juxtaposed that way have become coded. They've become sort of swept up in the increasing polarization that we see in our country. And so this will either come as sort of a relief or as a disappointment, depending on your viewpoint, but no. Professor Allen and I are almost certainly going to disagree. I mean, we're both philosophers, so it's kind of a professional obligation. Like, you can lose your accreditation as a philosopher if you agree too much with another philosopher. So that's like very likely that we're going to disagree. But what's certain is that where we disagree, we're going to view it as an occasion for engagement and curiosity about the contours of the disagreement. So we're going to be trying to model in our own interaction a kind of way of engaging across disagreement, which is one of the very things that I think is at stake in these discussions about speech and conversation on campus. Okay, so let's jump in. So we're going to narrow our focus a bit. You saw this already in the title. The topic is about speech and conversation on college and university campuses, not about free speech generally. There's a reason for that. One is, I don't know much about issues about free speech generally, but also more to the point, colleges and universities are small and close-knit enough that the prospects for thinking creatively about how we want to handle speech and interaction in our community are much richer. Like there's a much richer range of options available to us than there is in the public sphere. And also the stakes are very, very different in a college and university campus from the public sphere. So that's one way in which we're going to narrow our focus. I'm going to narrow my focus in these remarks further, focusing on the educational community as opposed to the research community. I think universities and colleges have two great obligations to society at large. One is to be a site for the production and dissemination of knowledge and understanding, and the other is to be a place where students, young people, can receive a particularly unusual and valuable kind of education. And issues about speech and academic freedom certainly intersect both of those goals. But partly just to keep things manageable, and because the issues are very different, I'm going to focus on the second, on the educational mission. Okay, so let's talk about how to productively get into this topic. Here's how not to productively get into this topic. Start talking about cancel culture, for example. That way, sort of collective, I mean, to be harsh about it, stupidity lies. Like I find it when people start talking about free speech on campus and they immediately say, well, the problem is cancel culture and people being attacked for what they say. And then another side says, no, the problem is that there are sort of a bunch of crusty old professors, typically white men, who want to preserve their privileges. The conversation breaks down immediately. Okay, and it's also a conversation that fails to be properly governed and enlightened by a clear understanding of why the issue matters. Like free speech on campus is something that gets people riled up, presumably because they think something important is at stake. And what I think we should do first is step back and ask, well, what is the important thing at stake? Or what are the important things that are at stake? So in my remarks, free speech is not going to make an appearance until much later on. I really want to step back and sort of dig into the foundational kind of questions about our values, like what kinds of values we're trying to secure and promote in colleges and universities first. Okay, and one way to do that is to ask this question. What's the point of colleges and universities? Why should a well-functioning society have them? Like, why are we here? My God, a philosopher asked, why are we here? No, I don't mean in the grand sense, but like, why are we as a community here? What's our, in what way would society be impoverished if colleges and universities disappeared? Or more to the point, if the kind of liberal arts education that we all take ourselves to prize were just, gotten rid of in place of something else, maybe something more sort of blatantly vocational. Well, in answering this question, there are some answers that we should acknowledge because they're out there and they have some purchase, but we should set them aside for our purposes. So it is true that one point is production of knowledge and understanding. I'm setting that aside for the reason already indicated that I want to focus on the educational mission, not on the research mission. There's some other, another sort of answer you could give is, well, the point of the kind of education we give is to prepare young people to do what we nerdy academics do. There's a certain amount of that, but that's not the primary point. I think it would be there are all sorts of, if you imagine a possible world in which everyone who takes philosophy classes goes on to be a professional philosopher, it's like an interesting possible world, but not necessarily one we want to aim for, okay? Much as I like a world with some philosophers in it, but that's not our primary aim. And we're very clear about that here at Harvard, I think. We're very clear that the kind of education we offer is supposed to have a distinctive value, notwithstanding the fact that most of our students are not going to go on to and produce, follow career paths that we have. Okay, here's some more cynical answers, but they're out there. Preparing young people to be good little capitalist worker bees. So when we talk about what's the return, what's the ROI on your college education, this is the kind of answer that people have in mind about why these institutions exist, to give young people a good return on investment. I'm just going to set that aside. Historically, another answer has been credentialing. A lot of businesses began, according to my friend Luke Manan, who studied this topic, in the 70s, using a BA degree just as a way to filter who they were going to hire. Regardless of whether the education that lay behind that degree was relevant to what the business was looking for. So these are all answers, but I want to forget about them and think about when we have this image of a liberal arts education in front of our minds, or when we listen to Rakesh, the catechism, which I think is beautiful, and I agree completely with when he talks about the transformative potential of the kind of education we're offering. What exactly is that? And can we get a clear enough vision of what's involved in that it can guide us in thinking about how we want to regulate and manage the way we converse and interact with each other on a college campus? Okay, so the question now is leaving aside all those other answers, what's the point? Why do we exist? Why does our kind of education exist? And I thought at one point, about a year ago when I was first preparing to give this talk at Carleton College, where I was visiting as a teacher, thought well, why not cast about on different college and university websites and see what the experts say? And this is just, so well, you'll see. So here's what Carleton said. It's not bad. Carleton College is committed to providing a true liberal arts education, a curriculum that challenges our students to learn broadly and think deeply. Instead of training for one narrow career path, Carleton students develop the knowledge and skills to succeed in any walk of life. The most important thing our students gain is how to learn for a lifetime: critical thinking, problem-solving, creativity, effective communication. These are the tools that transform a collection of facts and figures into a way of understanding the world. So that's kind of inspiring. Though it's maybe worth pausing and noting that there's certain parts of it that can still seem instrumental. Oh, good. If I go to Carleton, I preserve my optionality, right? Which is obviously not intended. But at any rate, it's also abstract in a way that I find unhelpful when I think okay, great. If that's what we want, what does it need to look like on the ground when we bring students, ideally students from very diverse backgrounds together and get them to interact? Okay. Here's Swarthmore. It's a bit pithier. Swarthmore College provides learners of diverse backgrounds a transformative liberal arts education grounded in rigorous intellectual inquiry and empowers all who share in our community to flourish and contribute to a better world. Also nice, but it leaves it somewhat mysterious how it's supposed to do that, right? And what exactly the sense is in which the education is transformative. That's sort of left in the dark. Here's Reed, my alma mater, which I had to include for that reason. Reed College is an institution of higher education in the liberal arts devoted to the intrinsic value of intellectual pursuit and governed by the highest standards of scholarly practice, critical thought, and creativity. Its undergraduate program of study is demanding and intense and balances breadth of knowledge across the curriculum with depth of knowledge in a particular field of study. The goal of the Reed education is that students learn and demonstrate rigor and independence in their habits of thought, inquiry, and expression. And if I was a young person, I'd think, okay, it's not going to be fun, whatever else it is, right? But again, there's this question left over, okay, that in a way, the aim here is fairly concrete, but it honestly does sound a bit like, okay, at Reed, we reproduce ourselves, the nerdy academics. We're scholars first and foremost. Well, why? In particular, if you're going to lead a life that's not devoted after you graduate to scholarly pursuit. Next one is just for fun, Williams. In the gentle light of the Berkshire Hills. Williams people. Williams pursues a bold ambition to provide the finest possible liberal arts education. If the goal is immodest, it is also vague. Bracing. Elevating the sights and standards of every member of the community, encouraging them to keep faith with the challenge inscribed on the college's gates, climb high, climb far. Okay, so the idea of actually laying out with any clarity what the core educational mission is has been abandoned here in favor of very sort of like high-minded poetic rhetoric. And then we have us. And I have to say, at first I was thinking, I could get to make tease like Rakesh about this too. But I actually think this isn't terrible. Like by comparison, it's not bad, And one thing that I think is actually important about the way I won't read through this because I can't do justice to it the way Rakesh done. But one thing that is I think attractive about the way we display our mission is the importance of diversity is really foregrounded in a way that I think is right. But still, if what I was hoping for was guidance about the nature of the mission that would allow me to think more concretely about how speech and discourse and debate should be managed and regulated in our community, I'm not really getting it yet. Okay. So I'm going to come at this from another direction. And in what follows, I'm going to make a great deal of use of work by a brilliant young philosopher, Elise Miller-Larsen, who was in our graduate program, just got her PhD last year. And I'm going to introduce the work the way she does. So this is going to look like a detour. We're actually going to have like a mini class in epistemology, for a bit, and then we'll come back to our main topic. But hopefully the connection will be sort of clear to you once we do. Okay, so here's a story, and this is familiar to a lot of you, I'm sure. So if it is, just don't say anything. It'll be more useful to you if it isn't. And even if it is, try to remember the first time you heard it and what your reaction was. Okay, here's a little story. A father and his son are involved in a horrific car crash, and both are rushed to the hospital. When the child is brought into the operating theater, the surgeon stops short and says, "I can't operate on this boy. He's my son." And we ask the question, how can this be? Okay, and you can just think about it. No, I don't want answers, right? And some of you will have heard this, and you'll have available a full range of answers. Some of you will have not heard it, but will still have available a full range of answers. Good for you. And others of you will be like me. When I first heard this, I'm like, huh.
Me too, Ned. I did the same thing. The first time I heard it. I remember when I heard it too.
Yeah. And you think like nowadays, partly because of advances like in social justice, when I give students who have not seen this question, they think, oh, well, he's got his parents are a gay married couple, right? And that's an answer. That's a perfectly good answer, right? That's a perfectly good answer. But of course, the answer that's missing, like for me and as Danielle said for her too, is like the surgeon's the boy's mother. And look, the point of this is not to say gotcha, like, ha, you thought you escaped the patriarchy, who did not, right? That's not the point. The point is to just make vivid and palpable a kind of cognitive deficit that we can all suffer from really easily, which is you face a question, there's a range of possible answers to that question, but some of those answers, for whatever reason, are just out of view for you. Like you can't bring them into focus, at least not without outside help, right? No. And this is, so here's Elise Miller-Larsen, who's the philosopher now at Brown, soon to be taking up a position in Vermont. She has this sort of insight about this that I think is, as a philosopher, I find fascinating and very, very important. And the insight begins with something that's like, will strike you as fairly obvious. Like there's a kind of ignorance that consists not in a mere lack of knowledge, but in overlooking a possibility. And that's what we saw in the previous slide. So ignorance, in other words, is a kind of cognitive blind spot. So let me just pause over this just so we get her terminology right. So what Miller-Larsen does in her work is like distinguish two very different senses in which someone might suffer from ignorance. One is very familiar and talked about a bit in philosophical work in epistemology. This is the conception of ignorance as like mere lack of knowledge. You're ignorant when there's something you don't know. So for example, you are all ignorant of what I had for breakfast this morning. At least I hope so, because the alternative would be kind of creepy. But if I tell you I had a bagel, right, now you know. Okay, so you were ignorant. There's this little like factoid that you did not have in your stock of knowledge, and now you have it. And we can use the word ignorance that way to label a mere lack, a mere privation. So Miller-Larsen's insight is that we get a much more interesting take on epistemology, on what it means to be a successful inquirer, if we focus instead on this other kind of defect that we are all capable of suffering from, which is a kind of inability to entertain a full range of possibilities. And one way of putting this is, if we think of, it's natural in epistemology to think of knowledge as the aim of inquiry. Like what it is to be a successful inquirer is to gain knowledge, and the opposite of having knowledge is just lacking it, right? And so ignorance in that first, merely privative sense is like the absence of the thing that's success. And now we can pivot and ask a kind of more interesting question. Suppose we grant there's this other kind of ignorance. It's not a mere lack of something. It's not merely that you don't know some fact. In fact, it has nothing to do, in the first instance, with what you know or don't know. It has to do with what you're capable of entertaining, what the space of possibilities is that you are able to survey in reflective thought. Okay, what's its opposite, right? If knowledge is the opposite of ignorance in the first sense of ignorance, what's the opposite of this kind of ignorance? And the answer is probably something like being a highly skillful inquirer, like being highly skilled at inquiry. And this is important for epistemology, and it's also important for thinking about what we're doing in the academy when we talk about the production of knowledge. In a lot of fields, like in STEM fields, it's natural to focus on the product, to sort of celebrate how much knowledge we have gained over the last several centuries of scientific progress, for example, how full our journals and textbooks are of things that we now know. And forget what the process was that necessarily led to that, what the process of inquiry was that subserved the production of that kind of knowledge. And when we teach students in the scientific domains, one pitfall, one sort of like, natural, but I think ultimately kind of a way of teaching students that's natural, but ultimately falls short of what we ought to be giving them is to present the task of learning to them as one of merely storing up in their own heads a certain, percentage of the knowledge that's been acquired, a certain percentage of the relevant knowledge. Or really what matters is teaching them the skills of inquiry that were the sorts of skills that would allow you to get there. And successful inquiry, if we think of sort of inquiry as like lying at the back end of knowledge, successful inquiry requires setting up a good question and then being able to canvass a sufficiently rich range of possible answers to it. It doesn't count as knowledge if you just guess or latch onto the true answer, but in a way that involved complete blindness to a whole range of other possible answers, and you just got lucky that the ones you couldn't think about were the wrong ones. That's not knowledge, right? So the kind of thing that Miller-Larsen is labeling by ignorance, you can think of as a defect right at the foundations of inquiry. It results in an inability to conduct inquiry fully successfully. Okay. And so understanding its nature, sources, and consequences is crucially important to epistemology, because inquiry is crucially important to epistemology. All right. Okay. All right. So, the rough idea is to the extent that we are unable to diagnose, guard against, and combat ignorance, we will be worse inquirers. And I take it doesn't need much argument about why it's important not to be worse inquirers, particularly in a situation where we live together in society and have to conduct inquiry together about how to live together, like what kinds of policies to follow, what to take on as beliefs of the society at large. So inquiry is central, and inquiry in the collective is central to being able to live together. Okay. So to the extent that we are infected by ignorance, we're going to fail at a task that is central to the prospects for our living well together. All right. So there's a lot one could say about ignorance, but I'm just going to kind of like skate lightly over a few what I think are sort of crucial observations. Partly so we have enough time for Danielle and for our conversation. But we can start by like just noting that there are two ways to ignore a possibility, at least. You might fail to notice it. That was the canonical example was the surgeon case. But you might also fail to take it seriously. You might notice it, but just dismiss it out of hand. No. And that's enough to corrupt inquiry, right? Like if you have a question, there's a possible answer to that question, but that possible answer doesn't get due inspection, inquiry's gone badly. No, at least just as badly as if that possibility wasn't on the table to begin with. Okay, so we don't need to distinguish those for our purposes. Second observation I think is really important. Individuals can be ignorant, obviously, but so can groups. So one way for a group to be ignorant, the most obvious way is every member of the group is ignorant of the given possibility. That's one way a group might count as ignorant of some possibility. Okay. Here's another way. It might be that each member of the group is fully aware of the possibility, takes it seriously in their own thought. But there are social forces at work in the group that prevent that possibility from being taken up into group level deliberation. So for some reason, the working example in my head of this comes from a scene in the movie The Death of Stalin, where Stalin is hanging out like over dinner with his like cabinet, and they're chatting with Stalin, and the tension in the room is just palpable because everyone in the room who's not Stalin is sort of deathly afraid for good reason of like saying the wrong thing, right? And it's clear in the surrounding context that the people in the cabinet are fully aware of the possibility that Stalin's policies are ineffective or poorly thought out in some ways. But there's no way that possibility is going to get raised up to the level of group level deliberation. Now that's like a particularly simple and striking example because like there's fear of like being killed by the KGB, that's silencing people. But it doesn't need to be that unsubtle. And we've all seen this among our students and even among our colleagues in certain conversational contexts where certain possibilities, might be salient to you and you might even think they're salient to other people, but there's enough uncertainty about what the social dynamics are that there's some felt risk in raising those possibilities up in the way that you would need to if they were going to be taken up by the group as a whole. Okay. So at this point, I want to just pause for just a little exercise on this point to help solidify it. So I'd like you all just to take a moment, like assuming you've got the idea here, that is the idea that social forces within a group can prevent a certain possibility from being taken up in group level reasoning. You got that idea in mind? So it's not that the individuals are ignorant, it's really the ignorance resides at the level of the group in virtue of the social dynamics within the group. So got that? So I want you to just pause for a moment and think to yourself of what you think is like a clear real world example of this kind of phenomenon. Like think of a group and think like, okay, I could see it's plausible to me, maybe I'm even confident that in that group there is this kind of ignorance given the social dynamics in the group. Okay, you got it? There's gonna be a quiz, so you have to really do this. Okay, has everybody got it? Okay, and now we're gonna do a little reverse polling. This is something I do in my classes. So indulge me. Everyone raise your hands, please. I mean it. Okay, so you've got your idea in mind, right? This is gonna be an interesting test. Put your hand down if the group you had in mind is your group. Oh, okay. That's not bad. You notice I did not put my hand down. When I first wrote this slide, of course the group I thought of was some other group. And I think that's actually pretty common. Either you were lying or this group is a little bit more broad-minded because many of you did put your hands down. But I think many people find when they do this exercise, when we think about this kind of ignorance, this kind of group level ignorance, it's very, very natural to think yeah, that's a problem we attribute to other people. I remember many conversations with Elise, who's my graduate student, about this, where she would talk about her experience sharing her work with other people not in philosophy. Like people in family and friends would ask her like, oh, you're doing a PhD in philosophy, what are you working on? She'd say ignorance, and here's what I mean by ignorance. I don't mean mere lack of knowledge, I mean this other thing. And she'd go through examples like the surgeon, and they say like, oh my God, that's fascinating. Like that is such an important topic. There's so much of that ignorance. So many people, so many other people are ignorant in that way, right? And I think like the lesson for us is, well, there's one lesson about ignorance itself. The way this kind of, it seems to be one of the psychological, whatever psychological mechanisms subserve ignorance are very good at protecting themselves. Like if you are subject to some kind of ignorance, or if you belong to a group where there are pressures from the group that reinforce ignorance of the kind that Miller-Larsen is talking about, they're also going to reinforce not only blindness to a certain possibility, but blindness to the possibility that you're being blind to possibilities. Okay. So that's sort of helpful to remember. Like I think in general, when we think about ignorance, like the right attitude to have going into the discussion is one of very, very deep humility. All right. Let's talk a little bit about mechanisms of production and maintenance of ignorance. And there's a whole lot that could be said about this. Like I'm mindful that there are cognitive psychologists in the room who know orders of magnitude more about this than I do. But I'll just make some like fairly basic observations that I think will be helpful in what comes next. So at the individual level, one mechanism of the production and maintenance of ignorance is threat avoidance. So let's compare a couple cases. So case one, you make me feel threatened by doing something that manifests hostility towards me. Like Salim yells at me or like comes up and punches me, or in some other way makes me feel like threatened by him. Salim is my colleague in the philosophy department. We get along, don't worry. Well, in that case, if I'm being threatened by you or feel myself to be directly threatened by you because you are doing something that I take to be manifesting hostility towards me, the question is, how can I respond? And one response, not the only one, but one reasonable response is just to avoid you, right? And it's interesting to compare a case that from the inside, I think, can feel the same, which is you're not directly manifesting hostility to me, but you're advancing an idea, say in conversation. Maybe you're defending it, maybe you're holding it up for consideration, say, oh, we should take seriously the possibility that blah, blah, blah. And I feel threatened by that idea, right? So from the inside, the threats can feel similar. Right? It can be, especially at the moment, it can be hard to distinguish them. But notice, like, avoiding you isn't going to help in this case. If your idea is what's threatening me, like, merely avoiding you, if that's all I do, that's not going to help. There needs to be a kind of psychological overlay if I really want to avoid the threat, if I want to dodge the threat. So in other words, I need to find a way to avoid your idea. One way is to dismiss it out of hand. There are different strategies here, so I'm just going to label a couple. One way is I could dismiss it out of hand. Another way is I could convert my hostility towards your idea into hostility towards you. So recruiting the kind of emotional response, anger, directing it at you in a way that allows me to disengage from having to think about your idea. And I think that's it's a very natural thing that I know from the inside. Oops, sorry. Like I've done that on countless occasions when I've been in arguments with people where they put forth something that I don't like and I don't really want to take seriously. Okay. But the result is, if I do that, if I respond to the threat in one of these ways, I've in a way just reinforced or made myself ignorant. I've rendered it strictly more difficult for me to take seriously a possibility that I ought to be able to entertain. So that's one kind of mechanism. Here's another, has to do with privilege. Now, I don't love the way the word privilege gets used in a lot of conversation. I think it can often be a conversation stopper, as when people say, check your privilege. Like, okay. But that said, I think the term itself is quite useful because it labels a real phenomenon that has serious epistemic consequences. The way I think about it, I don't have a fully worked out theory of this, but the way I think about it is like this. If I perceive myself to have higher status than you, that can make it even easier for me to dismiss your ideas that come from you. And easier because it can happen without the pain of feeling threatened, right? So, I'll give you an example from my own history. When I was a graduate student at Princeton in the late 80s and early 90s, the graduate program, not unlike many graduate programs in philosophy then and some to this day, was not a welcoming environment for non-white males, basically. No. In particular, if you were a woman in that department, you had to just work extra hard to be taken seriously. No. Women graduate student raises her hand, makes a point in seminar, professor says, okay, nice point. Who's next? Male graduate student raises his hand, makes more or less the same point. It's like, oh my God, that was like, good point. Wow, let's talk about that for a while. That kind of dynamic happened. And I can say that now, I can look back and say that now, not because I was vividly aware of it when it happened. I wasn't. I was in the relevant sense of privilege, in the more privileged position of not facing that kind of barrier whatsoever. So the possibility that standing to be taken seriously as part of the conversation was unequally distributed was just invisible to me. The possibility that that was a feature of the very program I was in was invisible to me until I became very good friends with some women graduate students in the program, and they trusted me enough to start talking openly about their experiences. Right? And if someone had advanced that possibility to me, it's not like I would have felt threatened by it. I'd be like, oh, come on. No, it's like anyone can say what they want, And I think that's a real phenomenon as well. And the reason I highlight it is I don't want you to think that the psychological signature, as it were, of the kind of ignorance we're talking about is that feeling of threat. That feeling of threat at an idea you don't like. You can be ignorant without any sense of feeling any sense of threat from ideas that ought to unsettle you, precisely because your felt social status insulates you from that response. And if you do have that status, of course, it also means that there are strategies available to you in conversation that you can use to just like smooth the way and make it the case that people who are trying to get you to entertain possibilities that you ought to take seriously, even though perhaps because they will be unsettling to you, can't. So if I could use my status to deny you the standing to be heard, I could treat you with condescension, derision, and contempt. I can use my status to take advantage of conversation-stopping moves. There are lots of ways that higher social status can be used to kind of adjust the parameters of conversation in ways that keep certain possibilities off stage because those possibilities come from people who have sort of lower status. So that I think is really important to recognize. Part of the reason I'm emphasizing this, by the way, is that in conversations I've had about free speech on campus, when people talk about things going badly, depending on who they are, they may emphasize one or another of these phenomena. And it's really important to recognize both. Like if you're someone who thinks like the main problem is those damn kids claiming harm because they encounter ideas they don't like, you're focusing on the first thing, threat avoidance. If you're someone who thinks the main problem is like those entitled old farts like Ned, who like want to maintain their privileges and status and not hear from people that have been historically marginalized, you're going to be having in mind this kind of phenomenon instead. And I think when people make those complaints, they're right, both of them. They're just not seeing the whole picture. And it's really important to see the whole picture. It's a way to make ourselves collectively less ignorant about the phenomenon of ignorance on campus if we recognize that both of these phenomena can be present. Okay, and I said this before, but it's worth emphasizing. I think this kind of ignorance due to privilege is a little more insidious than ignorance due to threat and avoidance because it's so frictionless. Like if my ignorance, my resistance to thinking about some possibility manifests itself by a feeling of threat when you put that possibility in front of me, that's at least something I can notice because there's some dissonance there, so there's some discomfort. And if I have a modicum of self-awareness, I might think like, why am I feeling so crappy? Like, what's going on? Like, why am I reacting this way? Why is my vision narrowing and, my heartbeat going up and so on? But if I'm dismissing your idea because it's like, yeah, whatever, because I have a felt position of privilege that I feel like entitles me to just ignore certain things, that's painless, right? That's very easy to do. That goes down smoothly. Okay, so next point is just a point about group level mechanisms of production of ignorance. I think there's a phenomenon that can happen in groups that I call anathematizing, which is worth bringing out explicitly. Suppose that membership in good standing in a group that I identify strongly with requires ignorance of a certain possibility, or at least it requires you don't raise that possibility in conversation. And if it requires that, the easiest way to meet that requirement is to become ignorant in Miller-Larson's sense of that possibility, to rule it out of my own thinking. Then I don't have to worry about raising it in conversation. I don't have to watch myself, right? Okay. It can frequently be the case that when group level dynamics reinforce ignorance of the possibility that P, they go much further than that in the following sense. So to begin, the group level dynamics, I said, reinforce the ignorance of the possibility that P. That is, to just coin this as a kind of quasi-technical term, it's anathema within the group to ask, could P be true? To actually raise it in conversation. The group level dynamics forbid that. Well, very often, if that's true, something else is true as well. Namely, it's anathema to ask, why is it anathema to ask whether P could be true? And it's anathema to ask, why is it anathema to ask, why is it anathema to ask whether P could be true? I'm going to stop in a minute. And it's anathema to ask, why is it anathema to ask, why it is anathema to ask, why it is anathema to ask whether P could be true, and so on. That is, the group level dynamics don't just reinforce ignorance of P at the superficial level, they reinforce it all the way down. And that's a way in which group level dynamics that subserve ignorance can be deeply self-protective. That's worth noting. Okay. Well, how do we push back against ignorance? I'll try to be a bit more quick here because I'm worried about the time. But cultivation of particular virtues can help. I think there's a kind of egalitarian curiosity, which is curiosity that begins from a presumption that you and I are equals, at least with respect to the thing that we're debating and discussing, that we can try to cultivate. There are various ways you can do that as an individual. You can strive to be curious about what you're missing. I can strive to be curious about what I'm missing. I can strive to be curious about an idea I find threatening. I can strive to be curious about why I find some idea threatening. That's even better, right, as a strategy. But all of those are kind of demanding. A good first step, which I would love to see just become a sort of part of the air we breathe here at Harvard, is I can strive to not automatically treat those who disagree with me as stupid, evil, or deranged. In my gen ed course, we use this all the time. Like, someone who disagrees with you, it doesn't, an explanation is that there's some combination of stupid, evil, or deranged. But there are other explanations, right? And it's worth operating with a presumption that one of those other explanations is correct. And I don't mean to be Pollyannish about this. Sometimes people disagree with you because there's some combination of stupid, evil, or deranged. That can happen, right? But the point is rather to go into our interactions with each other with a presumption that that's not the case, right? That you're innocent until proven said, right? Okay. And at the group level, we can cultivate norms that encourage the virtue of curiosity. We can set up structures designed to bring overlooked possibilities to our attention. We can reward successful heresy. There's lots of other strategies we can pursue. But now I want to zoom back out and go back to our question about college. Like, why are we here? Because now I think there's a partial answer we can give. I don't claim it's complete, but I think it's an important part of the answer. What is core to the educational mission and behind a liberal arts education? Well, here's the proposal. A liberal arts education should aim to equip students with the skills, knowledge, and habits of mind needed to diagnose, guard against, and combat ignorance in Miller-Larson's sense, not mere lack of knowledge, but this other phenomenon. Okay, to diagnose, guard against, and combat ignorance both in themselves and in the groups to which they do or will belong. And that, I think, is for me, at least in my thinking about this, is much more helpfully concrete about what's central to our mission. Okay, it's not the whole thing. Like, for example, you should also learn some stuff. That's a good idea, right? But I think it's an important part, an important reason why a well-functioning society needs institutions that provide such an education. So when Rakesh talks about citizens and citizen leaders, I think, well, you can tell me, I think his vision of what those citizens and citizen leaders are able to do is facilitate inquiry in this way, in a way that guards against ignorance in themselves and in the groups whose inquiry they're trying to facilitate. Okay. So with that aim in view, we can think better about why free speech on campus matters and, crucially, what kinds matter. And here, my own thinking about this has been helped quite a lot by a distinction from this philosopher, Teresa Bejan. Teresa, if you're watching, I apologize if I butchered your last name. But she draws a very, very helpful distinction between two kinds of freedom. And I think, honestly, a lot of our conversation about free speech on campus would be helped if we just made this distinction part of the lingua franca. What she does is she distinguishes between what she calls parrhesia from the Greek, which is freedom from fear of retaliation for one's speech. Retaliation does not mean critique, right? It means retaliation, right? And oftentimes when people think about protecting free speech, that's the first thing they go to. That's the freedom they have in mind. And especially if you think like, oh, cancel culture is terrible. What's terrible about it is that it corrodes that freedom, right? So, and that's important. That's very important, right? You can't, if we think about what it takes to have a community in which we use the diversity of thoughtful opinions within our community as the material out of which to collectively grow our wisdom and understanding, that requires engaging across those boundaries of disagreement. And that's not going to happen if people are fearful about what will happen to them sort of reputationally or materially if they say the wrong thing in the wrong group. You know, if they have a conversation that's not with a carefully vetted group of friends. Right? So parrhesia, it's easy to see that's like essential. It's an essential freedom that we want to support on campus. But there's another one, which she calls isagoria, also from the Greek, standing to have one's speech be heard and engaged with. And that's very different. Now, to bring this out, I could go back to the example of my graduate program. If you were a woman in my graduate program, you had parrhesia. You could say things, and people would not jump down your throat about them. You wouldn't be marginalized for saying the wrong thing in seminar. It's just you wouldn't be paid attention to. So you had parrhesia, but you did not have isagoria. For a more extreme example, imagine to just see how these two can come apart. Imagine on the one hand a situation in which we're all in a room shouting at the top of our lungs and no one's listening to anyone else. Everyone has parrhesia, no one has isagoria. You can imagine the reverse too. Imagine a situation in which we're all deliberating about what to do. And everyone gets to speak and everyone's viewpoint is very, very carefully weighed and assessed. And at the end of the deliberation, there's a vote and the losers are executed, right? Then you've all got isagoria, but no one has parrhesia. So these are really conceptually quite distinct. And I think conversation around free speech on campus can go badly south if we just fail to distinguish these and fail to remember that different constituencies in those conversations might be more focused on one or another. We should be focused on both. But very often you can see like a failure to engage properly around these issues because one side has in mind, well, there have been voices that have not had standing to be heard. And the other side has in mind, the use of threats to shut down speech is too rampant. Okay. So just a note about this, when I say engaged with doesn't just mean responded to somehow or other. It really requires that one's ideas be taken seriously, ideally precisely in a spirit of that kind of egalitarian curiosity I was mentioning on the earlier slide. Okay. So they're different, they're logically independent of each other, a well-functioning, I'm thinking of a classroom setting first and foremost. It's not like there's lots of other places where we engage on a college campus, but oftentimes I find it helpful to start by thinking about the classroom setting because that's a site that's very important to our students and one where there are opportunities for building the norms needed to secure both parrhesia and isagoria that are difficult to execute, but easier to execute than, say, a dining hall or a residence hall. So I just say that because I don't mean to be limiting my attention to the classroom, but it tends to be the place I start from in thinking about this. So in a well-functioned classroom setting, it will be common knowledge that all members enjoy both of these. There's also a responsibility that goes along with this, especially in a classroom and setting. A well-functioning classroom should also feature something like commitment to the collective aim. That is, when you enjoy these freedoms, you use them responsibly with the collective aims of the classroom in mind, whatever those are. And I think like in the ideal case, when we talk about what we're trying to jointly accomplish in a classroom, of course there will be, greater understanding of some specific subject matter that is the focus of that class. That's obviously going to be part of it. But I also think that in the background, a background aim in the best of cases will precisely be helping each other get better at diagnosing, guarding against, and combating ignorance by the way we engage with each other in the classroom. Okay. And so when both of those freedoms are in place and that shared commitment is in place, then I think a classroom conversation can become a powerful anti-ignorance tool and an exciting and even joyful place to be. And I'll just close by saying, partly because Rakesh is here and I love any opportunity to tease Rakesh. When Rakesh started as Harvard College Dean, I remember being in meetings with him where he would be discussing some challenge that Harvard faced. And he would say, what would we do about this if we were Harvard? They'd say, if we were Harvard, here's some things we might consider. And I think that's appropriate here. Like, if we were Harvard, well, the first thing we would recognize is that we do not have a community bound together by a deep common understanding of the importance and equal distribution of Parisia and Isagoria. We are not there, right? But if we were Harvard, we would think creatively together about ways to build that kind of community. And that's going to be hard. It's going to require, I think the administration to take some public stands to help solve what's currently a coordination problem, that people are just not sure that we're all on the same page about our core values. That's definitely not going to be enough. It's also going to require a lot of effort on the part of faculty in thinking very creatively in ways that might take them outside of their comfort zone about what's required to really, really reinforce both of those freedoms in the classroom. In the recognition that in the past, we may have done a decent job of securing Parisia, but we have not historically done a good job of securing Isagoria. And I think we just need to recognize that. And I think if we were Harvard, we would begin this work together by having a conversation about what's at stake. So I've put forward my views about that. And in a second, Danielle's going to kind of offer some, I think, insightful responses to them. But I think if we want to make progress, that's the place to begin. Not directly with complaining to each other about how bad things are, but thinking together about how we articulate what's at stake in a way that'll guide our collective decision-making together. I think that's what we would do if we were Harvard. And I'll just close on with an optimistic observation, which is that we are Harvard. So thanks.
Okay. So let's see, is the mic on? Did that work? Great. Okay, terrific. And I was just eating peanuts, which means I have to have a little water because otherwise I'm going to cough because they're so dry. So first of all, it's just great to see you all here. It is September, which means it's the tsunami of the start of the year. So the fact that you have managed to secure time for this important conversation is extraordinary. So I just want to thank you for making that effort. And I want to thank Flynn, Ned, everybody else for organizing this. It's such an important conversation. Dean Conant for also making the time to be here. So it's a pleasure to be with you. And I want to start by just saying I think that in many ways, Ned has given us a really helpful framework. I think the expansion of the concept of ignorance is extremely useful. Certainly at an institution whose purpose is truth-seeking, academic excellence, correction of ignorance has to be a fundamental project. And to increase our understanding of what's entailed in that is incredibly valuable. Now, having said all that, I'm going to revise the second half of your talk. I'm going to offer some additions, really, some things that I think bring out some of the things that are among the harder problems in this space. So I'm not sure we've gotten to all of the hardest problems. And we need to do that too if we're going to make progress together. So I cannot claim to have sort of worked this through as fully or carefully as Ned. So you'll have to forgive me on that front. But nonetheless, I hope to make a couple of basic points that I hope will bring out the issue. All right. So we had two mechanisms for producing ignorance, the first of which was threat avoidance. And I'm going to focus on this one first because in some sense, well, only, I'm not going to talk about the other one. I think this is actually the one that we have the harder time understanding how to respond to. And I think the thing that is missing here is something that an idea I take from William James. We're going to bring our different kind of philosophical orientations to this as well. I'm a pragmatist as a philosopher, so William James is a source I consider particularly valuable. One of his core ideas is that ideas are rules of action. Beliefs aren't separate from the world of their concrete implications. And that means these two cases don't cover the waterfront of experience. The problem, the challenge, is the third case, where the idea makes me feel threatened because I immediately imagine the downstream actions that flow from it, and those actions would be acts that manifest hostility toward me. Okay? Did everybody follow that? So let me give you two really concrete examples. They're not they're sort of real world examples. I mean, I actually do know of instances of this kind, but they're not the common real world examples. They're not the hardest cases in that regard. And I'm going to offer them, but also noting that as I express these hypothetical points a person might make on video, a person could snip my words out of context and attribute some really outrageous things to me. All right, so none of us is able at this point to function without having that broader context in mind, and we have to say that out loud too. So, two ideas that would make me feel threatened, be very, direct and so forth, would be a person who wanted to make the case that it is justifiable to enslave human beings and to decide whom to enslave on the basis of the color of their skin. I would consider that threatening. They might not have evidenced any hostility to me in saying that. Might have done it in a perfectly polite and considerate way. But ideas are rules of action, and I would immediately have concern about how a commitment of that kind would translate into effort in the world and what I should do about that. Or, this one might be more accessible to others. Somebody wants to make the case, I don't think it should be illegal to kill somebody because you're jealous that they've cheated on you. Yeah, that shouldn't be illegal. Yeah, of course people get jealous. I mean, but you shouldn't cheat. That's a reasonable way of responding to cheating. If I get quoted out of context, that'd be really bad, right now, okay? So there is such a thing as moral error. It's another category of ignorance. I consider the view that it's justifiable to enslave people a moral error. I consider the idea that murder should not be illegal a moral error, all right? And so the question of how do you respond if somebody articulates a moral error, the downstream consequences of which, if beliefs turn into action, would indeed result in manifestations of hostility. How do you respond to that? Okay, and we'll come back to the issue of the gray area problem in a second, because I just gave you two pretty clear cases of moral error, right? So if we then, let's move to the slide that is about how I respond. Egalitarian curiosity. So I agree, we need egalitarian curiosity. We need that for the most part. However, I don't think I should strive to be curious about either of those ideas that I just articulated, okay? I don't think I need to be curious about them. And I don't even think I need to be curious about why I find them threatening. And let's see, right, okay. I do agree that I shouldn't automatically treat those who agree with me as stupid, evil, or deranged. Okay, and so the questions I have, the kind of curiosity I have, should be of a different kind than this. Not about the ideas as such, but about why this person has fallen into moral error. All right, I should be curious about that. And I should bring a certain kind of responsibility to that. This is going to lead me to somewhat revise the picture of responsibility that you are putting alongside the freedoms. Okay? And the kind of responsibility I should have to the curiosity about that person, how did they fall into that moral error? What should I do about that moral error? Because that's a moral error that has consequences in the world. I can't actually just walk on by that moral error. Can't just walk on by it. Because if it's an idea that spreads, it's a problem. That would be a problem. So I've got a certain kind of responsibility to the actions that would follow from that belief, even though all I have right now is the expression of belief in front of me. All right? So what is my responsibility to that moral error, the person who's expressed it, and anything subsequently that might flow from it? Here, I draw, in thinking about this problem, on the work of Martin Luther King Jr. and one of his late essays, which I'm going to forget the exact title of it right now. It's Affirmation of Integration or something like that. It's got the word affirmation. It's a very positive essay, and it's got the word affirmation in it. And in the essay, it is a beautiful, brilliant essay about the ethic of nonviolence and the ethic of how you deal with real threats nonviolently, and what your responsibility is to the people who are threatening. And the important part of the argument is the sort of conception of thou-ness, which he gets from both a philosophical tradition and a religious tradition. The idea that the human being in front of you, regardless of the quantity of their error, is sacred. is sacred. And so you have a responsibility to interact with them with that commitment to their thou-ness, to their possibility to do better, to improve their own thinking. So in that regard, you are, in adopting that ethic of thou-ness, accepting the role of a teacher. So that's where it gets to be interesting, comes back to our context. Because the truth is, like, our kids make errors all the time. They don't just have interesting ideas. And we wouldn't say that a kid say, yeah, 2 + 2 is 5. We shouldn't say we should be curious about that, right? We shouldn't strive to see what the basis is. No, that's an error. We need to help them correct that. But we have to bring the ethic of thou-ness to that project of correction. That's the important point. And that ethic of thou-ness and the project of correction of that kind, you can get access to it by thinking about the ethic of nonviolence. Now, the hard thing about that, though, is that it means for most of the time, if things are going well in our classrooms, we can live in this universe that you've sketched here. And this universe is a very good one, very helpful one for navigating a whole heck of a lot of stuff. But the problem is when we get to those cases that are in the moral error category, but that's only the second hardest problem. The hardest problem is the cases that are at the line between, interesting idea that we should, or, maybe like heretical idea, but certainly we should entertain it, and what's actually a moral error. Like, how do we know where the line is between moral error and heretical but considerable idea? Yeah, that's what we're struggling with on college campuses, is that problem. So I don't know the answer to that question, okay? Don't know the answer. The only things I know are that if we're going to begin to address that problem, we do need this ethic. But when we come to the responsibility page, where do we go? This one is not enough because we need that thou-ness commitment. And there are things that are difficult about that thou-ness commitment. For the person who is in the position of teaching, okay, so I have to teach somebody that enslavement is not a justifiable concept, okay? And that is a real example. That one is actually a real world example, okay? Really? I've got to put my time and energy into that? I would much rather be working on other kinds of problems. And so this is a tax on my capacity to actually pursue the truth. You are wasting my time. And my time is my life, which means you are, in fact, doing me damage. All right? So, all right, it's like a big thing I've got to take on to accept that I have to be pedagogic, have an attitude of thou-ness, and try to pull people out of moral error. It's a big ask. It's a reasonable ask to make. And that's what the ethic of thou-ness, the ethic of nonviolence teaches. That's what, King's argument about how do you interact with segregationists. It was that. It's a big ask to ask people to bring the attitude of thou-ness to somebody who's espousing segregation. But it's an ask we have to make because of what it is to build a community and what it is to build a human society that's got justice and human flourishing in it. And yeah, it sucks that you are in the position where your thou-ness job is to take on this pedagogic role, and that's just the way it goes. Like, that's the sacrifice you have to bear, the burden you have to bear. But it requires certain kind of acknowledgement of that. There are thou-ness burdens on other sides as well. I'm only articulating one kind of thou-ness burden. But the important point is that kind of responsibility is a lot harder than this. And Ned left out some of his material. He's got one beautiful slide which talks about how one of the hardest parts of all of this is about emotional self-regulation and emotional intelligence. And the thou-ness burden or ethic that I just described is all about that. So how do we help our students? How do we help our faculty understand that responsibility of thou-ness, like that gotta correct moral error, but in a way that is egalitarian, does not make the person feel like you are shutting them down or destroying them or demeaning them. Rather, you are inviting them into a better place that will be better for them as well as better for you. But that is hard to do. It is very hard to control the emotions that are aroused when ideas are immediately connected or beliefs to the actions that would flow from them, and those actions would, in fact, be experienced as acts of hostility if you had to endure them. So that's why this is also hard, and where I do think we need work and to work together to try to find the answers to how we build up that capacity for that emotional intelligence and that emotional work with each other. So I look forward to the conversation.
All right, thank you both. We're going to do some Q&A now, and so I'll just throw it open to the floor. We'll try to take a couple from online as well. I do have a microphone I can pass around, or if you're far up, you can just speak loudly and we'll repeat it.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, Jeannie.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I am very provoked by both of your remarks. And Danielle, I will say your second example about whether it's morally justified to kill because of you encounter cheating by your spouse, that is actually, law that I teach to students. And it's interesting. And I think the fact that you put that in the category of this is moral error, and then your attitude as a teacher is to, experience thou-ness, to try to lead people out of moral. It's just an interesting frame because that was our law and is still our law in some parts of the country, that you get an excuse because it's considered like the paradigm example of when you're so provoked that you're kind of justified for killing. But I'm saying this almost as a preamble to explain what I think is the most difficult problem using your framework today, which is that, as a teacher who teaches criminal law, sexual assault, murder, in constitutional law, affirmative action, abortion, all of those topics, the moral error framework is in fact very common among our students in that they think that the other side is committing a moral error. Yep. Especially, people who believe in affirmative action, it's a moral error to think that it's unjustified. And if you are pro-choice, often what I get from students is that it's a moral error to think the other way. Surely on the other side as well, we just don't have as many of those students on campus. But so is this the right framework? Because there are certain things that are so extreme, like the slavery example, that we could all, many of us, we could agree with you that this is a waste of our time, and yet we take it on as a burden. And yet, in the live issues that are embroiling our society, at the Supreme Court and in the rest of and half the country feels one way, half the country. I mean, is it the right framework to think of this as our role as teachers as treating one side's view as a moral error and then proceeding that way in the classroom?
So thank you for your question. And what you've done is elaborate the point I made about the gray area, right? So I didn't.
It's not a gray area. Like that is the area.
That is, well, exactly, yes. That's why I said that the hardest problem. However, it is entirely possible that some questions in that space we might eventually come to think include some moral errors. We may not now, but we might. I mean, as you know, Harvard had a debate, graduation, 17, I don't remember what year, 70 something or other, about whether slavery was justifiable or not, right? So it was not in that category at that point in time. So that's exactly the point that I'm trying to make, is that yes, people bring the moral error conception to the table in terms of how they understand what's happening on the other side. Even in those cases where people are bringing that conception, we can do better if people are willing to adopt the sort of thou-ness responsibility in relationship to the conversation, all right? But yes, we also need to widen the frame for the kind of questions that are considered totally up for debate and discussion and not, in fact, in the moral error category. How precisely we do that, how precisely we give people more clarity about where the line should be, that's what I don't know. But I don't think we can actually abandon the category of moral error.
Yeah, right here. Just thanks, Dean. So Lachlan Farr, I'm at the med school and Center for Bioethics, but just my immediate reaction to this is and channeling Ned, it would be pragmatically helpful if I think that opposing affirmative action or opposing pro-choice is a moral error, I've got that sense, but I know I live in a country where a lot of people feel that way, to be curious and try to center myself in my curiosity about how can a person like you have come to that position, and that curiosity by itself, if I can see the value of that to me pragmatically in the country where those positions are frequently held. Because if I don't understand that, I'm never going to be able to work in this country to get it to where there's less of that moral error.
So, Lachlan, I appreciate that very much. And I mean, that's part of, I think, what we need, right? I mean, that's why I was trying to add that quality of curiosity to this. I mean, sort of curiosity about the human being and not just about the idea. And that is actually part about the emotional intelligence, in fact. But I think to Ned's point, it matters that there also be curiosity about the ideas themselves, right? So, I mean, that's the problem with the moral error framework, is that too many things are cast as off limits for intellectual understanding. All right. So I agree with Ned that we need to bring a heck of a lot more stuff back inside the limits of to which we should apply the egalitarian intellectual curiosity that Ned articulated. But I think the truth of the difficulty we face is this issue of how people respond to what they understand to be moral errors. That's where the difficulty is. I don't think we can abandon the category of moral error, and then that produces a different set of puzzles for us to solve.
Thank you, Danielle, my colleague, Ned. I'm Dan Carpenter from the Gov Department. A slight shift of gears here. I want to rethink this concept of privilege a bit in a way that potentially gives a bit more credence to this idea of somebody asking you to check your privilege. Not that I think that's a helpful phrase. I don't. But I very much like where you're coming from, Ned, with this idea of privilege as something that I can use to basically dismiss another person's idea, to deny their isegoria by just saying, well, you're negligible at some level, right? Ethically or probabilistically negligible. There's another way, I think, I think of your surgeon example, and I imagine, okay, so suppose that a first year comes to Harvard or to any other school, and they come from a completely patriarchal society, right? They just cannot imagine in the world that they've grown up in that a surgeon is a woman, right? And at some level, what that means is that the set of social facts that basically generated their probability space, almost in the literal mathematical sense, just doesn't include that possibility, right? And one might consider that a different kind of insulation that is purely factual, and maybe it crosses these two modes of ignorance in a way. But part of what we would say is that person came from, at least from maybe a feminist or an egalitarian standpoint, that person grew up in a society that was extremely privileged. And that privilege functioned to basically render impossible a really important possibility, right? And one advantage of that person coming to a place like Harvard or any other school is that they might learn. I mean, I know that's an extreme example, but let's face it, 100 years ago, there were many such societies, and there might be many such societies or families or clans or things like that now, right? Now imagine, if I can just flip this a little bit, a modern college campus in which nobody really truly believes, or at least 99.9% of truly believes, that the union of a sperm and an egg, a zygote, is at that moment a human being deserving of some degree of legal protection, right? I'm not going to go there in terms of that debate, right? We could all have it. But I'm just suppose that we live in, and I'm talking about even the vast majority of people who call themselves probably pro-life in the United States. A very small percentage probably subscribe to that view. And yet there are people in the world who do, right? And the reason I'm making this point is that somebody might come from a situation like that of a different kind of privilege. And again, it's not like they dismiss these other ideas. They just can't imagine because they don't interact with those folks. And part of the university's job, our job, is to interact with those folks. And I'm exploring this alternative idea in part because it seems to me to function at least or provide a platform for a diversity in its largest sense, right? And again, heavily used term. But we might all be better in a world where actually we grew up and we met folks at college or in schools where, their mother was an engineer or their, genderqueer father was a homemaker or something, right? And we might also be better at a place like Harvard if, and I'm going to be incredibly stereotypical here because I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, where there's some kid from rural Nebraska who grows up thinking, actually, yeah, the minute the zygote forms, it's a human being every bit as dignified as anybody sitting in this room. So just throw that out there as a different kind of idea about, well, actually, there are forms of privilege that don't have necessarily to do with hierarchy. They have to do with the fact that we've just constructed in many, many, many different ways these kinds of bubbles. I know it's not a question. I'm just throwing it out there.
That sounds right. Just to respond briefly, like if we think about like the way that resistance to a possibility can get manifested, there's the possibilities that I feel to be a threat. There's the possibilities that come from people that I feel to be beneath me. And then there's the possibilities that where the very thought that someone could view things that way is just like completely off my radar screen. I'm not threatened by it because I'm oblivious to it. Right. Yeah. That seems like a useful distinction. Yeah. Yeah.
John, do we have an online question we can do?
Okay, I think both of you. What can be done at Harvard to change the culture to support free speech of exactly the kind you've been discussing? And how do we change the culture that creates fear of censure that is so embedded now?
Start. You want to start?
Sure, you can go first and have it out.
Complicated, multifaceted question to begin with, but I do think it's worth mentioning. One step that no one should think is going to solve the problem by itself. That would be a terrible mistake, but it would help, which is a clear, forceful endorsement of a well-crafted statement of values on the part of the administrations across the different schools, because it would solve a coordination problem. So you've heard me say Paresia and Issagoria are both important. So it's a logical consequence of that Paresia is important, and we don't safeguard it well here. And one thing that I've seen happen up close is that it can get compromised in cases where someone gets upset. A gets upset because of what B said, or because of what they discover B researches, whatever. And A could be an individual or it could be a group of individuals, calls for some sanction to be imposed on B, maybe an investigation. Maybe have their tenure revoked, whatever. And the administrative structure doesn't know how to handle this. No, like the key points, people who are at key places in the administrative structure are unsure what kind of response they can give because they're unsure what their colleagues in that administrative structure will support or not. I'm describing in the abstract, but that's because I don't want to go into details on YouTube. Sorry, not gonna, right? But that kind of dynamic has unfolded. And it has lots of knock-on effects, like the individual people involved can have their lives turned upside down, but also when these kinds of examples are known throughout the community, it can just reinforce a climate of fear. And at least at that level, we would do much better if there was a common understanding across the people in administrative positions who have to deal with conflicts that erupt, that there are certain things that are just not actionable. There's certain kinds of complaints that while you can understand that the feelings of hurt that generate them, the complaints themselves and what they're asking for by way of redress is to be summarily dismissed. in the legal sense of summary dismissal, not in the emotional sense, because that's an important distinction. And that's not, that's not going to solve everything. In fact, if that's all we did, it could easily make people who feel like their voices have been marginalized just feel more so. So it would not be a good idea to do this except as part of a package deal of efforts. But that's one piece. Do you want to?
Sure. No, I will throw a few things out and actually connect an answer. I guess it's not your question, but since you vocalized it, back to something that Jeannie, you asked, because I think in our exchange, something may have gone invisible, which would be bad if it did, right? In saying that there has to be responsibility of vowness, I'm not saying that the correct thing when you hear moral error is to shut it down or to say it can't be expressed, right? I'm just saying that this set of attitudes can't be the whole picture of the norms needed for dealing with moments of speech where what you hear, you take to be a moral error, right? So we need more to that normative code, so to speak. So then in terms of what can Harvard do, I think Ned is right that I think actually having an explicit statement of principles would be quite valuable. I think an interesting step to get us in that direction would just be to go ahead and have, mentioned this before, sort of a forum where we go ahead and hear about the campuses that have adopted the Chicago principles and what has that meant on their campus? How has that changed things, et cetera? I mean, who thinks it's helped? Who thinks it's hurt? What's been the actual situation? Ditto, they're sort of a group of folks that some people at Princeton have organized, developing something called the Princeton Principles. That should be part of the company. So some of these pre-existing things and the kinds of experiences people have had with them, I think it would be great to have a forum about. When the Chicago Principles first came out, we were talking about this before. I read them. I was like, well, yeah, basically this is kind of what we all think. What good does it actually do to put this, on paper? And I have been surprised by the number of people on campuses that are using these principles who've said this has really helped. And I think we ought to understand a little bit better, empirically speaking, what that means. What has that experience been? So I would sort of start there, to be honest. It's just plain let's have a forum about the use of some of these things, how it goes, what people have learned from it, and then see what we might take from that for understanding our own circumstances.
We have lots of hands. We'll try to take a couple more all the way in the top.
No. Actually, I'm going to have to go in a second. I apologize. So that's all right. Okay, thanks.
Hi, thank you so much, Danielle and Ned. I'm Susanna Siegel from the philosophy department. I wanted to highlight a kind of disconnect I found in teaching between the perspective of faculty, especially longtime faculty for whom like the ivory tower means a certain thing, means a kind of place where we are just having a discussion in the classroom. And so for us, it becomes a lot easier to bracket the rules of action that Danielle mentioned that might immediately come to mind when someone brings up a question, as opposed to students, especially young students, especially politically oriented students, especially activist students, especially Harvard students, who do not immediately experience the classroom as a kind of ivy tower that is insulated from the rest of the world. And in fact, for them is very much of a stepping stone to the rest of the world. And the reason that this disconnect in perspective seems important to me in this context is because I think for students who don't have our sense of how insulated the classroom, the discussion is, the imagination, I'll use Danielle's vocabulary, their imagination of the rules for action are extremely close to the surface of their mind. So when we ask what might we do as teachers in the classroom to help set up the sort of atmosphere that we all want to be able to have to deal with the gray areas, with the moral errors, and with the rest of it, I think one thing we could do is to just highlight what might not be apparent to all the students, but is hyper apparent to some of them, that sometimes when certain questions or topics come up, it is likely to, some students are going to experience, say discussions of marriage or discussions about relationships are admissible in society and so on. They're going to experience that understandably as continuous with speech that really is threatening in other contexts, even if it isn't and shouldn't be threatening in the classroom. And just being aware of that distinction, I think could go a very long way to just lowering the temperature, because not everybody, we as professors experience the Ivy Tower as the glorious insulated place that it is, and with good reason. And Ned, you say this often, and I appreciate it when you say that. But I don't think the students experience it as very insulated at all. So I think we should actually thematize that as teachers in our classrooms.
Thank you. And
Yes, thank you all so much. Please join me in giving a hand to Ned and Danielle.